So I was asked to speak to the rather daunting task of Europe, which is, depending on how you define it, 47 or 27 different countries. So I can't pretend to be an expert on every aspect of European prenatal diagnosis, although I am a member of a working group developing guidelines for prenatal diagnosis in Europe. So first of all, I wanted to just present kind of a snapshot of some issues in Europe that are relevant to non-invasive prenatal diagnosis. And I just wanted to say also that I use the term NIPD because that's the term that we use in Europe. I take on board NIPT. I would prefer that, I'm sure, if we thought about it. But we do use the term NIPD. So Europe has, not surprisingly, a wide diversity of health systems, regulations, guidelines regarding PND, and I think that's quite important. So the existing care contexts are quite different, and values, which I'll discuss. But in Europe, there's an emphasis on developing professional and laboratory standards to ensure quality while remaining flexible to different health systems and legal contexts. So that's kind of how we work in the European context to work across different health systems. NIPD is currently in limited clinical use, and as I'll show, it's primarily for rhesus D testing and fetal sex in some health systems, not all. I received an email yesterday from someone in Slovenia who said they're now trying to develop rhesus D testing there. And it's primarily available in Europe on a research basis, but in clinical service in just several countries. There are some efforts to develop health system-based tests, and I'm going to talk specifically about the RAPID project in the UK, previously the SAFE project, which was an EC-funded project. And also with NIPD, we're looking towards harmonization across Europe in terms of laboratory standards and quality. There is a focus also on implementation in current care pathways, specifically for high-risk pregnancies, but it remains a question about NIPD for Down syndrome, although prenatal screening for Down syndrome is well developed across Europe. Some of the background trends that are interesting is that maternal age is rising rapidly while live births are declining. And a colleague of mine from Denmark recently showed a pair of graphs that basically went like this and like this. I mean, it's quite striking. In most countries, we have relatively liberal termination of pregnancy legislation, largely around physician judgment, the terms of which are not well defined. And I'll show you a graphic. It's difficult to be specific about everything. There is a declining use of amniocentesis and an increasing use of CVS for invasive prenatal diagnosis across most countries. And in many countries, fetal anomaly screening is offered to all pregnant women beginning in the first trimester, but there are variations in specific screening protocols. There are overall high participation rates in screening. There is a rapidly growing commercial sector and genetic testing provision. And the guidelines that I was recently involved in drafting, we specifically included a statement that changes in screening and diagnosis should not be driven by commercial interests or technological innovation, but by clinical utility. And I point that out because that is a philosophical point in Europe. And also we have, as you probably know, pretty cash-constrained public health systems at this point. So cost is a big issue. In terms of values, this is a graphic from my Danish colleague, and it says, imperfect children. Screening reminds us of, I think that it's pretty graphic here. So there are variations in antenatal culture across Europe, and in the Netherlands particularly, where most pregnant women are attended by midwives, there is a resistance to medicalization of pregnancy, which translates into less interest and uptake of testing. In Denmark, the termination of pregnancy rate after fetal anomaly diagnosis is falling, but trisomy 21 does remain by far the major indication for termination of pregnancy. This is just a probably illegible graphic showing a little bit of termination of pregnancy legislation in Europe, but you can see that most of Europe is covered by a wide range of indications. Only in Malta is termination of pregnancy banned altogether. In Ireland, you can see it's only to save the life of the mother. So it's pretty liberal overall. I put together a table of country by country use of NIPD and a few other comments that I wanted to bring up just because they're interesting in terms of context of introduction of NIPD. So in Italy, NIPD is currently in research use only and focuses on fetal sex, RHD, thalassemia, and cystic fibrosis. 63% of women have their first child over the age of 35 in Italy. And there is a large private sector activity that focuses on younger women. And fairly commonly across Europe, the commercial sector is picking up where health system provision leaves off. So where there are well-developed guidelines for who's to receive what within a health system, the commercial sector offers, for example, extra ultrasound tests and so forth. Another interesting thing about Italy is that the changing population pattern, that is immigration to Italy from southern part of the world, is changing antenatal care use and the disease profile. This is why thalassemia is included in their research use of NIPD. So termination of pregnancy is decreasing amongst Italians and increasing amongst immigrants. And immigrants are also more likely to come to care late, which has implications obviously for antenatal care pathways. And another interesting aspect of Italy is that obstetricians are reimbursed in private practice for invasive tests they do, which has implications also for the uptake of NIPD. Sweden is interesting because it has very wide regional variations. It's not very centralized at all in terms of its antenatal care provision. In terms of who should be offered what nationally, no national guidelines, and also a very big private sector, and has been described to me as being, because of that, very chaotic at this point. Belgium has NIPD on research basis only. They have a fairly large multi-center research protocol going on at the moment. The Czech Republic has no NIPD on the health system, but interestingly, they have two private sector companies offering NIPD for Down syndrome, Sequinome and Arrival, who's coming in at a much lower price, and appear not to be worrying about IP in that context. There are a lot of private centers also in the Czech Republic. Finland is not offering NIPD on a research basis or in the health system, but they have look to what's happening in Sweden for RHD and fetal sex. The Netherlands also has an ongoing clinical trial, but NIPD is available for RHD and fetal sex routinely in Amsterdam, not so much in the rest of the country or just at major centers. And as I said before, young women appear to be rejecting screening in the Netherlands. In Denmark, NIPD is routinely available for RHD and fetal sex, but not for single gene disorders. And the number of Down syndrome babies born has become, another graphic about this, quite an issue in the media recently. In Spain, they provide NIPD for fetal sex and X-linked disorders, but not for Down syndrome. And this is in research. Some other issues. The United Kingdom, which I'll talk about more specifically, NIPD is clinically available for fetal sex for X-linked disorders and congenital adrenal hyperplasia. It's occasionally offered in other circumstances, but that's rare, but the requests are increasing, is reported, and these include achondroplasia and thanatophoric dysplasia. So hemophilia was a condition that was removed from the gene dossier for fetal sex because it was not the clinical utility was not proven, and that's an issue that I'll talk about in a minute in terms of the gene dossier process. In the United Kingdom, 2% of the pregnant population undergo invasive testing currently, and I've included something about the philosophy regarding NIPD for single gene disorders here from the UK. It's for conditions for which we currently offer invasive testing. So there's a concern in the UK about what we call specification creep, which is both not offering testing for tests that have not been ethically vetted, but for tests for which we're not currently testing. That is not driving expansion of testing because of the technological capacities. A big interest in developing patient and healthcare provider education. So we have a very, and particularly a role of standards, lab standards being harmonized across the UK and Europe. So we have a very controlled, conservative healthcare system-based approach with clinical utility and lab standards at its core. Down syndrome NIPD test development is proceeding at pace. Lab standards have not been developed yet, but although it is in clinical trials. So in summary, NIPD is still mostly available in research settings. RHD fetal sex are the primary indications for high-risk pregnancies for NIPD. The state system sits side by side with an expanding commercial sector. There's very little control over the private sector, and regulation is difficult or not possible. Health systems with well-structured antenatal care pathways, such as the UK, and guidelines are further down the road of implementing NIPD than those that are looser or somewhat more chaotic. There is no non-research availability of NIPD for DS except through some private sector provision. And a company, Life Codex, is currently planning to roll out NIPD for Down syndrome to German-speaking countries. They are a license holder of the sequenome test. Another issue I thought was important to bring up, because we've been talking about genetic counselors, is the situation of genetic counseling is quite different in Europe. There's a huge variation in the number of genetic counselors, and here we're talking about non-medical genetic counselors, not clinical genetic specialists, in the number, the roles, and their education across Europe, because there's a range of professional traditions across the countries. So in the UK and the Netherlands, there are more than 4 counselors per million population. That probably doesn't sound like a lot to you. Well, in Germany, Hungary, Turkey, Poland, Lithuania, Czech Republic, and Russia, there are no non-medical counselors whatsoever. Genetic counselors and/or genetic nurses currently practice in a range of other countries, including France, which has the only legal structure for genetic counseling, and a number of other countries listed here. And in the UK, genetic counselors operate as part of a multidisciplinary team in every genetic center and are not involved in counseling for prenatal screening generally. That's done by midwives. So genetic counselors only get involved in high-risk pregnancies in the UK. So in Europe, we are also concerned about NIPD and implications for genetic counseling. And research that I've done into public attitudes in the UK did identify concerns that people having NIPD outside a clinical setting, where, as I will say, I believe it's most likely to occur, would not receive sufficient support and counseling. So as I said, since 2003, NIPD has been used routinely as part of specialist clinical genetic services for high-risk pregnancies to identify fetal sex. To the extent it's been so successful that NIPD for fetal sex determination has become the most frequently requested molecular diagnostic test in prenatal medicine on the NHS. And NIPD is replacing rather than supplementing invasive testing for fetal sex in many cases. And Rapid recently did an audit of 2 labs providing the service. Only 32.9% of women using NIPD for fetal sex for clinical purposes went on to follow that with an invasive test. NIPD tests for single gene disorders are under development, but often on an ad hoc basis and on incremental developments in NHS labs. So conditions such as achondroplasia and thanatophoric dysplasia, also sickle cell, and others I'll mention in a minute. So there's clearly evidence of support for the ongoing development of use of NIPD in the UK. The NIHR is funding a 5-year program called Reliable, Accurate Prenatal Non-Invasive Diagnosis, or RAPID, which is sponsoring the clinical trials for DS and also has been evaluating the laboratory standards for fetal sex and for RHD. The RAPID project is quite broad in scope and also includes interesting qualitative research on women's experiences of NIPD and additional work on the ethics of NIPD. And I've included the website here, which lists many of these publications. And I'm sure some of you are familiar with these publications. Interesting, fetal sex determination using NIPD in the UK is only available in a few locations, and there's concern that there is considerable inequality of access because of the commissioning situation. And I have to say that this is going to be changing again because we also have healthcare reform. Ours is kind of going in a different direction than yours. And we really don't know exactly how genetic commissioning is going to occur in the future, although it's likely to be much more centralized than it is now. So these are the indications for fetal sex for which it is available as a clinical service in the UK. So Rapid has decided to submit a gene dossier for fetal sex. And gene dossier is the way that genetic tests, which are lab-developed tests, are indicated as of sufficient quality to be made available for commissioning in the NHS. To say that, it's rather complicated. But the gene dossier is an evaluation process that is based on the ACE criteria. Mark had a nice circular diagram of the ACE criteria, and that is the case on which hemophilia for fetal testing as an indication for fetal sex determination with NIPD fell down. So the the UK genetic testing network required that hemophilia be omitted as an indication. So the fetal sex for X-linked disorders and CAH have been approved for the gene dossier, and gene dossiers have been submitted for achondroplasia with 29 diagnoses performed in the UK. Most of these are at UCL or Great Ormond Street Hospital, and thanatophoric dysplasia, 15 cases. A number of other tests are in development in the UK for sickle cell anemia, thalassemia, cystic fibrosis, Tay-Sachs, and muscular dystrophies, and also cases are done on an ad hoc basis. The Down syndrome tests are not available in the UK, and this is I included this because it's the perspective of the developers. It is important to note that there is a small false positive rate. This is not acceptable to the developers, which they are still considered to be an advanced screening test that should be confirmed by invasive testing. And many of the limitations that have been discussed already are part of the reason why that it is currently felt that NIPD should be confirmed by invasive testing in most cases. And also that there is concern about the information that is lost with NIPD, including information that might be lost from the first trimester combined test, which increasingly provides information about complications of pregnancy as well as other anomalies in genetic syndromes. So according to Rapid, ultrasound will be required in the delivery of any test based on cell-free fetal DNA, either screening or diagnostic, to confirm the gestational age and number of fetuses present. And there is a big question about whether any new tests for Down syndrome would replace current screening tests. This is still quite, okay, I'll keep talking fast, quite a question. The alternative would be to use NIPD in conjunction with current screening, either to replace invasive testing or as a form of contingent screening, or in addition to the current screening tests. But given the cost constraints we currently face, the latter approach seems unlikely. And it's considered that it's not wise to abandon combined screening if the programs are already well established, which certainly in the UK they are. Also, some research has shown that in the UK, health professionals seem to consider NIPD to be more like Down syndrome screening than invasive diagnostic testing in terms of the need for written consent and performing the test on the same day it's offered. And this is a concern. And also there's hesitation because the very complex IP landscape that has already been laid out for you has yet to play out. So, yeah. So from the patient's perspective, it's critical that access to testing is not restricted or curtailed as a result of patent enforcement. Further, hopefully, commercial companies do not restrict accessing by pricing NIPD out of the market for widespread use. But this is primarily a problem for publicly funded systems with fixed budgets. We have no information about consumer demand or price elasticity with NIPD testing in the commercial sector in Europe, and I think that's something we need to be looking at. I just wanted to show you this. This is the official antenatal care pathway on the NHS. And the green, you can see that Down syndrome screening is well developed. The green is that, but also in the early, you can see also that there's quite a lot of drawing of bloods for various conditions or indications in the UK. Looks pretty daunting, doesn't it? So Rapid did recently a survey of European labs offering NIPD. They got 52 replies from 27 countries, 19 of which are in the EU. 17 labs currently offer NIPD, and the remaining plan to develop NIPD in the next 2 years, as my colleague in Slovenia indicated. The indications listed were for fetal sexing, for rhesus in high-risk pregnancies, and somewhat for trisomy, and I have that in a graphic here. This is the question. My lab offers NIPD for the following indications. So fetal sex, you can see, is by far the greatest indication. And other indications include both trisomies and single gene disorders. There is concern about the direct-to-consumer market, and I just included this, I think it goes in another test, because I wanted to point out that this is the pink or blue early gender test. It used to accept samples from customers, now only from obstetricians, but it used to exclude samples coming from China and India, but it now offers instructions in French and Italian. The only way I can put those things together is that there is a sense that there's quite a commercial market available in Europe. And this is a UK-based test. Not only does it market internationally, it includes a translation button that for Croatian, Slovenian, Slovakian, Finnish, you name it, it's up there. So that also is commercial. So I conducted a public attitudes study in the UK looking at lay reasoning around the introduction of non-invasive prenatal diagnosis. And we identified 4 distinct viewpoints, one of which, the most strong of which, was discrimination against the disabled. So the public viewed NIPD through the lens of disability. That was the most important viewpoint that came across. So questions raised by NIPD for Down syndrome or aneuploidies are different than they are for the more limited clinical conditions for which they're currently being used. That is the question of diagnosis versus screening. Will it be delivered universally across the developed world? And if not, what kind of implications does that have? How will current practices influence service delivery, which is quite varied across Europe, and cost implications are quite important as well. And how can we regulate commercial provision? So some summary thoughts. While there is significant interest in clinical utility of NIPD, there appears to be little enthusiasm in Europe for countries for health system provision of commercially developed NIPD. So much more interest in lab-based NIPD for a limited number of conditions, emphasis on quality control and standards, and uncertainty about IP and implications, which translates also into concerns about cost from commercial providers. There is an increasingly robust parallel commercial provision of tests for which there is consumer demand, tests for which there is consumer demand that is beyond what's provided on any particular health system. NIPD has already entered this space in some countries and is likely to continue to do so. However, as I said, we don't have any evidence to date about consumer demand outside of health systems across Europe. There are concerns about counseling, the implications of that kind of commercial provision, placing a burden on genetic counseling on health systems, and really no systematic way of addressing that. And the best guesstimate I can get from anyone is that Down syndrome testing using NIPD is 3 to 5 years off, largely because of the attempt to harmonize laboratory standards. And it's not clear that the gene dossier process is the appropriate route for Down syndrome testing, and I don't know how that will go. I'm not very good with PowerPoint. I tried to make this is one of, I like old maps. I tried to make her skinny. But I couldn't get it to do that. But health system cost constraints are likely to be a significant feature of the landscape in Europe for some time. So private provision is the most likely route. And we just don't know how cost-sensitive consumer demand will be. Thank you. And I want to thank my sponsors.
We have a few minutes for questions. While anybody else comes up. So when your survey of labs, where the labs said that they were doing fetal sex testing,
Yes.
was that only in a clinical context where it was fetal sex testing that was recommended for a specific clinical reason like an X-linked disease, or were they saying they were doing sex testing for patients who were just curious about the sex of their babies?
We didn't get that information in that particular survey. I do have information about another, that some labs are doing it for information only. And it's not strictly legal to do fetal sex for non-medical indications for that to be provided, at least in the UK.
In the UK. You say not strictly legal, does that mean?
Because we recently had a sort of a scandal where we do this with newspapers, did undercover stings. They went to various obstetricians and said, had a mock patient say that she wanted to have fetal sexing for a non-medical condition, and several providers were filmed saying they would be happy to do that in different words. And so that has the legal analysis now is that the language is so vague that although it is intended to be illegal, it isn't. It hasn't been put to the test.
Any questions from the audience?
Did the government organize those sting operations? Who headed that up?
That was, I believe, the Telegraph, which is one of our supposedly more non-sensationalist newspapers.
Less sensationalist would probably be a better way.
Less sensationalist, yeah.
Thank you very much.